Okay, what is up? We are going to do the book of Ezra this morning. Here's a timeline of the different kings that you're going to get. And it starts out with Cyrus. The first three chapters are of him. Everybody skips Cambyses. We feel sorry for him. It's a 10-year reign. It was a great one, but never gets any airtime. Darius, though, gets quite a lot of airtime. You can almost say that like chapters 4 through 6 were kind of about him. Then Xerxes, he's talked about, but Artaxerxes is where everything happens in Ezra and Nehemiah. Now, Artaxerxes actually makes a cameo. He makes an appearance in the story of Darius in chapter 4. There's a weird timeline thing that happens that we'll have to look at. All right, let's look at the text of Ezra. So what do we have here? So in order to complete the word of Yahweh from the mouth of Jeremiah, by the way, I am reading from this Legacy Standard Version, Steadfast Bibles, I guess there's LSB. All right. Highly recommend, very good translation. And this particular version puts everything, each verse on a new line, which is very nice. All right. But right off the bat, you have, in order to complete the word of Yahweh from the mouth of Jeremiah, Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that a proclamation might pass throughout all his kingdom. First of all, stirred up the spirit. We still pray today that God would stir up the spirit of people, right? That's a theme that everyone whose spirit God had stirred is one that you see here in the book of Ezra. There's this very cool interplay in the book of Ezra between the responsibility and the actions of man, and then this sovereign action of God. Okay. So there was this word of the Lord from Yahweh in the mouth of Jeremiah that starts the whole thing. And that is one of the major themes in the book of Ezra too. In fact, one person said that the reason there's so many of these decrees that it will outline, there's like a decree, it will talk about these words of these different people, even the pagans. And that's because they're showing you the power of the word, even if it's not. So here you get this one here too. Even if it's not a powerful word, maybe it's the comparative power of these different words. But here is the decree of Cyrus. And you'll notice it's sort of put here. It talks about who the God of Israel is. It talks about building up this house, Bayet, I believe, which building up the house of God is the major theme, I think, probably of Ezra and Nehemiah. The theme that sort of sets it apart, kind of ties everything together, and you just notice it as you pray through Ezra and Nehemiah, you're going to be praying that the Lord's house might be built up. So that's one of the things that happens. And then may his God be with him. This is that statement, really, I believe, of God's active presence in their life, which you'll see later on when Ezra talks about the hand of the Lord being upon him, the hand of Yahweh. All right, let him go up to Jerusalem, and which is, I'm reading now on verse 3. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of Yahweh. Now, here, obviously, the house of Yahweh refers to the temple, but even within Ezra and Nehemiah, this term house, Father's house and that sort of thing, gets expanded to be talking about other aspects of their life, other aspects of their new community there as the exiles brought back from captivity. Which, being brought back from captivity, by the way, is another main theme of Ezra. So, here in verse 1, in order to complete the word of Yahweh from the mouth of Jeremiah, the mouth of Jeremiah had prophesied that at the end of 70 years this would come to an end. And this tradition is very conversant with the Daniel tradition on several aspects of the return from exile. When you get the prayer in Ezra 9, that is definitely echoing the language of Daniel's confession in chapter 9 as well. And he talks there about the end of the exile according to the word of Jeremiah. Of course, all of that tradition is conversant with First Kings 6 and the Pentateuch passages that talk about return from exile as well. Here in chapter 1, you get a really cool theme here. Let the men of that place support him with silver and gold. And you get it down here too. It talks about it again. But you get this idea. It seems that there are these Gentile gifts coming in to the people of God, streaming back to Jerusalem. And ultimately, we know that this gets picked up in the treasure of the Gentiles coming in to Christ, even now as the Gentiles come to Christ, as all of the nations do. Not much more to say. Obviously, all of the gold and treasure that King Nebuchadnezzar had stored is now going back. And this is the story of what happened under Cyrus. By the way, notice how it's talking about came up out of captivity. This is obviously a very positive way of speaking. This is one of the tensions in the book is, are we done with captivity or are we still a part of it? And you'll see that as early as chapter 3, I believe. Okay, chapter 2 is just genealogy, or a list actually of people that have come up. Just a lot of logistics. Not much to talk about, honestly. Here you get a purification passage. There is a pretty big theme in Ezra of the purity of God's people. And so here they're just trying to show you their strenuous qualification. So these searched for their genealogical records, but they couldn't be found, therefore they're considered unclean and excluded from the priesthood. I think the obvious parallel to the New Testament is not a genealogical qualification, but the qualifications laid out for pastors and for deacons, and being rigorous about the enforcement of those qualifications, I think, is in, this same sort of spirit of the purity of God's people that you're seeing a concern for here. You see it again as they're trying to separate themselves and that sort of thing. These laws about the purity go back to Numbers and their concern for that sort of stuff. Alrighty. So here, one really cool thing here in chapter 3, you got this altar and the daily offerings. The whole thing is going to be about this foundation of the temple, but before they get to any of that stuff, they talk about the offering setups that they have. So they have this continual whole burnt offering that they set up here, where they gather as one man. You'll see this assembly of the people be pretty strong a few different times within the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, but they're offering these burnt offerings, and you really get the picture that before they build their own houses or before they do any of these things, this whole section is being portrayed very ideally, chapters 1 through 3. They are first making sure that they have a place for the worship of Yahweh. And this reminded me of Psalm 132, where David would not go into his own house until he found a place for Yahweh. So you've got these people here are seeing the importance, really, of God's house. And this is almost like a tabernacle sort of thing again, that they don't actually have a temple, but they know that the worship is more important than the house itself. When they can't find the house, they still need to do the worship. So they're doing that. They're practicing the Feast of Booths, which, by the way, itself has this new Exodus connotation to it, the Feast of Booths. And so they go out to the countryside and they look for different trees and different things like that, so that they can celebrate that. And then, probably the most famous passage of all of Ezra is this foundation of the temple of Yahweh. Now, there's some interesting stuff with the dates. May of 536. This one is, in my opinion, not quite as 70 years-ish. Some people try to make this as 70 years, and they'll go back to, I believe, like the very first deportation, not in 586, but there are some earlier ones that might sort of be able to fit that category. In my opinion, the laying of the walls later on is a more close date to the to the 70 years concept. All right. So as we go through this, we do pray for the purity of the church, for the purity of the elders, and the purity of the deacons in the church. Pray that even in our own lives we would make room for you in our worship before attending to our own things that we think that we need, that you would come first, even in our own lives, that we give you the first fruits for the building of the house and that sort of thing. Here they're appointing Levites. We still appoint people today. We pray that that is done well. The house of God, here is an emphasis on that as well. Cymbals and trumpets and praise, instruments, and the life of God's people in their praise has been there for just so long. According to the directions of King David, I think here they're just trying to show you this restoration theme. That's what all of these are trying to pull out, is that this is a return to this ideal era here. I also think that this is kind of cool because this is not them inventing something. The regulative principle is there in the scripture, which just means that we are not inventing praise to do however we like, right? We've been commanded to do certain things in certain ways. And this is all very orderly, but also still full of gladness. So I don't know if gladness is actually found here. There it is right there. There's the gladness, huge theme of public worship in Ezra and Nehemiah. In fact, in Nehemiah at one point, people are crying over their sin and he tells them to cut it out. It's a public worship, a time for gladness set apart for that purpose. But one of the cooler things is he says, he is good, his loving kindness endures forever on Israel. For he is good, yep. So upon Israel. And here, one of the things about the goodness of God, for those that are outside the church, they're never really going to see the goodness of God unless they're part of the church. It's one of these things that's hard to see the fullness of it unless you're seeing it through the lens of his goodness towards his people. And this is absolutely the case. We just thank you, God, for your goodness to us. I pray that we would be able to see our lives through the lens of your people, that we might be able to see your goodness in our own lives. Please help us, Lord, to worship you according to your commands, Lord, and let that be through instrumentation, and let it be through other means of singing and that sort of thing. Here, we also pray for our corporate worship to be full of gladness, as that's one of the major themes here, Lord. But we also pray, Lord, that you would help us to mourn with those who mourn. So this is just a fascinating passage because you get the gladness of heart. That's the major theme going on here. This foundation is being laid. Lots of people are very grateful that all that they've ever known is, exile and captivity and slavery. That's all they've ever known. And now they get to see this foundation being laid, not at their expense, but the emperor's expense. And they are quite happy and they're praising God out of gladness. But these others cannot help but weep and wail because they remember how, like, the height from which they have fallen, pretty much. And this is really the state of the church today, this already and not yet. We have great reason to rejoice. The already of the Christian faith is just incredible, right? We are these released captives, but the not yet is still there. And yeah, I think this passage also gets at how do you rightly facilitate a public worship gathering, where probably the purpose of it is more of the gladness of heart, and yet so many of the psalms are full of lament, right? And so here, I think this is maybe even the expectation that we should have for a modern worship, is this mix of joy and grief that you see here. That brings us to the end of this first kind of ideal passage. Later on, so we'll go through 4 through 6 and that sort of thing, but a lot of the themes that we saw here, take the Feast of Booths, for instance, they will do later on, and when they do it then, it's almost like they're discovering it for the first time. It's kind of interesting. But a lot of the themes that you're seeing here, like the gladness or their trust, their consecrating themselves, their purity of the priesthood, and that sort of thing, are some themes that will come up later on. And I think they kind of look back to this generation as an example or a paradigm. And that's what's going on here in chapters 1 through 3.